pleasure to be here again this year. For the last 35 years, I've had the opportunity to be the director of the True North Health Center, which is a very unusual facility in that it works with highly motivated patients that are serious about getting well. We work with a lot of people that have conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes and autoimmune diseases. And these conditions have something in common. They're actually conditions of dietary excess. They're actually caused by poor choices about what we put in our mouths and how we live our lives. They used to be called the diseases of kings because it was only the wealthy elite kings that would get these chronic degenerative diseases. Now, of course, they've become ubiquitous and they're common because even people of limited means in our societies are eating like only the wealthy elite would have been able to eat in the past. The conventional management, as you heard earlier this morning, isn't about curing the conditions, it's about managing the conditions. The one promise that medicine gives you, for example, if you have high blood pressure, which the majority of people will if they live long enough to retire, 30% that are over 20 years old do. If you have high blood pressure, your physician will tell you to take 1 or 2 or up to 5 medications and promise you that if you do exactly what you're told, you'll never get well. They'll promise you that you'll be sick forever and you'll be on drugs for the rest of your life. And that's true with diabetes, it's true with autoimmune diseases, and all of these conditions, because the medications, of course, have nothing to do with dealing with the actual cause of the problem. But there is an alternative way to do that, and that's what we try to focus on at the True North Health Center. The premise that we're operating on is that health is the result of specific actions, that it's the result of healthful living, and that healthful living involves diet, environment, activity, and psychological variables. Perhaps the biggest effect size is manipulating our diet, what we put in our mouth. And we advocate a diet that's exclusively whole plant foods. And foods that are free of chemicals added to the food. And those chemicals that we add to the food are why we get fat and sick. The chemicals that we add to the food artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain, this process that we associate as pleasure, and we overconsume. It's not actually just human beings that get into this pleasure trap, it's actually all animals on the planet. And it's eating these chemicals that makes us fat and sick. If you're a mouse and you eat ad libitum, that as much as you want, of the available normal rat chow, you get to a certain size. And then satiety mechanisms kick in and you stabilize. If you take those mice and add these chemicals to the food, they'll increase their weight 49% in 60 days. So what are the chemicals that you can add to rat chow or mice chow to get them to overeat and become obese? They are salt, oil, and sugar. SOS. SOS is the international symbol of danger. It also stands for salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not food. They're highly fractionated, concentrated components added to food with the purpose of stimulating dopamine production in your brain so that you experience that food as more flavorful. That's what good taste is whatever it is that stimulates more dopamine production in your brain. If you give these chemicals to the mice or the rats, they become obese. Now, did the rat become fat because of psychological variables primarily? Did mommy rat not love him enough? Did daddy rat love him too much? Did he have stress? Or is it biological reasons? Because you overstimulate dopamine production in the brain, they overeat and they become obese. It's clearly dominantly biological. And the reason why we become obese is because we expose ourselves to these same chemicals, the salt, oil, and sugar. It's called the pleasure trap. It's the hidden force that undermines health and happiness. If you want to get into the weeds of that, you can come tomorrow. I'll be doing a full day looking at all these variables, or you can read our book, The Pleasure Trap. What I'd like to do at this point, though, is spend just the few minutes I have left to talk about a way that we use to help patients escape the pleasure trap and, more importantly, reverse the underlying diseases that are so common. And that's fasting, which is a very ancient approach that we use in a modern perspective. And we use medically supervised water-only fasting from 5 to 40 days. And we do it with some great success. We've published a number of studies, all of which you can view on our website if you're interested. I'm going to be sharing with you just one case report and its follow-up because I think it demonstrates what the potential of fasting actually is. This particular woman that came to us was 42 years old. She had follicular lymphoma, which is a type of lymph cancer. It's an interesting condition because the medical treatment, the chemotherapeutic treatment that's often used is not effective. So therefore, it's not particularly treated aggressively early on because we know that the treatment doesn't affect all-cause mortality, has tremendous side effects. It's a disappointing condition in many cases from a medical management. In this particular case, she'd had 2-year history of progression of this cancer. Her family physician, when she asked him if there was anything she could do to slow down or reverse the process, for example, could she make dietary changes, he assured her that diet had nothing to do with this condition and that she should be comfortable eating whatever she wanted. She asked him, what about things like fasting? And he assured her that was actually criminal quackery. So then she went to her oncologist after they had tracked her for a couple years. She spoke to the oncologist, asked the oncologist the same questions, was assured that diet wasn't really an effective intervention, that fasting wasn't going to be useful. And so given that tremendous and consistent medical support, she decided to come to the True North Health Center. And she underwent 21 days of water-only fasting, during which time her tumors disappeared. So we could literally feel these masses that were externally palpable disappearing. By the end of 3 weeks of fasting, she didn't have any tumors. We refed her for 10 days, sent her back to our oncologist with some coaching. During this 3 weeks, she lost 22 pounds, which is about what you expect. Average weight loss in fasting is about 1 pound a day. When she saw the oncologist, she said it was an interesting experience because he examined her, and like us, he couldn't feel any residual masses, and he looked at the chart, and he was looking at the picture on the chart and looking at her. And finally, he asked her what happened. And she said, well, she went to the criminal quacks and did the fasting, and the tumors went away. And he said, well, that was interesting, and he'd have to give us a call. She also asked him to do a follow-up CT scan, which he refused, because he said she didn't need it. And she said she wanted to objectify the changes, and he got a little nervous, and he explained to her that he'd been in practice 25 years, and she didn't need any CT scans because he could feel that the situation improved. She persisted. Eventually, he agreed to do the follow-up CT scan because we had asked her specifically to do that because we knew we would need to objectify the change. The thing that was interesting, at that point, she was still neutropenic. Her white count was still a little bit low. He suggested maybe they should do a little gentle chemotherapy, but she refused. And at 2 months, she was 139 pounds. So you can see that in the 2 months after fasting, she had dropped from 152 to 139. Now, how do you think she did that? Yeah, she went on a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So she ate a whole plant food diet, so fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, without the addition of the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, sugar. I told her that she needed to comply well with the diet or it could kill her, because I would track her down and do it myself. So she did comply. At 6 months, her counts had completely normalized. And by a year, we decided it was time to write up the case report. So I sought some advice, and they said, look, if you're going to submit the case, find a relatively small impact journal, and above all else, don't mention the dietary intervention. Just talk about the fasting. If you start talking about whole plant food, you'll never publish it. So given that sage advice, this is just her CT scans before and after. Before and after. So given that advice, what I did was we wrote up the case and submitted it to the British Medical Journal because it was the biggest impact journal we found that does case reports. And we specifically included all of the details about the dietary intervention in this paper that was published called Water-Only Fasting in the Management of Follicular Lymphoma using a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So interesting feedback from reviewers. They felt that because about 10% of lymphoma patients go through spontaneous remission, it could have just been coincidence Yes, it was unlikely given she'd had 2 years of progression of the condition, and within the 3 weeks of fasting it completely resolved, but nonetheless they said that they would like to publish the case report, but they wanted to do a long-term follow-up. Because in cases of follicular lymphoma that go into spontaneous remission, they tend to recur. So we published this paper, this was 4 years ago, and then followed the patient for 3 years. At 3 years she was 136 pounds, which meant she had done what? Yeah, she maintained the dietary compliance. She felt great, had a full body CT, negative for any sign of lymphoma, and then we resubmitted the paper as they had invited us to the British Medical Journal for her follow-up, at which point it was rejected. These were different reviewers this time. One of the reviewers said, well, it's very interesting, but she was probably just lucky. Nonetheless, we appealed, and the editors decided to publish the paper. So we have the original publication and a 3-year follow-up. Now we have a 4-year follow-up, and she continues to do very well, and she continues to comply with the diet. So I could, and I will tomorrow, go through dozens of examples, of what we see and what we expect in using a simple and natural intervention like fasting and this dietary approach. But what I can tell you is that conditions of dietary excess, for example, high blood pressure, we have a paper, 174 consecutive patients with hypertension, 174 people achieve normal blood pressure without medication. These conditions are highly reversible and highly predictable, but only if you're willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise, learn to do stress management, and go to bed on time. What I'd like to do is, I think that'll complete my formal presentation. I believe now we're going to have a chance to...
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful information. Please give a big round of applause to Dr. Allen.